Hello, everybody. Earlier this month, we did a show with my old friend Gary Marcus. He's perhaps the world's most controversial skeptic of AI. But even Gary acknowledges that in the very long run, artificial general intelligence, what's known as AGI, is inevitable. In other words, whether it's 5, 10, 20, 50 years, we're on the road to artificial intelligence and AGI, where we will create smart machines that are much smarter than we are individually. In other words, we're on the road to building a new kind of God, for better or worse. That indeed is the subject of a new book. And of course, there are many new books on AI. Every day a new book seems to come along. But I was particularly intrigued with the title of this book by my guest, Christopher DiCarlo, PhD. Building a God, the ethics of artificial intelligence and the race to control it. Christopher is joining us from Guelph in Ontario, in Canada, or it's currently in Canada. You never know in the future, Christopher, you might become part of the United States. How and why are we building a God with AI? What do you mean by this?
Right. So there's a set number of big tech companies, Sam Altman and Dario Modi and even Elon. And the race has been on for quite some time to build a very powerful system. The problem with building a very powerful computational system is that the more it scales up and the more data you give it and the more powerful it becomes, the less control we might have over what its capabilities are and what it could do. That is just based on its own proclivities, let alone what others might be able to do with this type of technology. But it will have godlike capabilities should it reach a sufficient level of intelligence, what we call artificial general intelligence.
Before we get to AI, what do you mean by God? It's, of course, a controversial three-letter word. Why is what is godlike about God? What do you mean by it?
That it will have the capacity to make inferences at greater capacity than any human or collection of humans ever possibly could. So when you think about what is a genius, when we define a genius, I got a little thing of Einstein here, Newton, there's all kinds of people who have existed in the past that we call geniuses. If we just stick to the sciences, what makes a scientific genius, a Rosalind Franklin or anyone else, is that they could see connections where the rest of us couldn't. These are called inferences. They can make inferences based on the information we all have, but they see it. They connect the dots. Well, you build a super brain that far exceeds all human capabilities and intelligence, and you tell it essentially to keep improving upon itself, make itself better and better and better at what it does, and on the way, start making some inferences. It's going to come up with some pretty interesting scientific discoveries. Hopefully, it'll cure diseases. It'll help us solve world problems. We build telescopes to see further into the distant sky and microscopes to see further and further down. Now we're just building bigger and bigger brains to think for us better and better. That becomes godlike at some point.
Do you think that it's a coincidence that we're building this God? In other words, given the human preoccupation with the creation or invention or recognition of a God, that now we as a species are in the business of creating one for ourselves?
Yeah, I set out to build essentially what's happening today. In the 90s, I was working on various things I called relations of systems and was developing a model of information theory. And it occurred to me that this could be done back in the 90s. So I approached, deans of engineering departments and politicians and pitched the idea that we should start to build this thing because it's going to help, say, politicians make better decisions because they will be given better information on which to make those decisions. So I was never able to get the type of funding I needed, which is enormous, but I knew somebody someday was going to build this machine. And I was very concerned as a philosopher of science and ethics that whomever was going to build it might not have the safeguards in place while they are building this machine. And my colleagues and I figured this was 50 to 100 years away.
I'm not sure you're answering my question, though. My point was, we as a species have always imagined something that's smarter than we are, that exists, maybe created the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is more, is it coincidental that that we've invented this thing called AI, which you call building a god? In other words, is this just the next chapter in the history of religion?
I'm not sure about the history of religion, because when you look at religious definitions of God, they're top down. You know, they're purported beings that are very, very powerful, that have the ability.
Well, not always. I mean, there's the Buddhist tradition,
Oh,
other
yeah,
Asian traditions, which are less
Yeah.
top down.
Yeah, but the Abrahamic ones, you know, that predominate the world's populations, they tend to be very defined in ways that are, you know, omniscient and omnibenevolent and omnipresent and so on. But they're top down, right? They built us. They want us to act in certain ways. If we do, then, you know, we get treated well. And if we don't, we get treated poorly. And now, for the first time in our history, it's a bottom-up approach. We're the ones who have to figure out what goes in to the making of a supreme intelligence. And therein lies the problem.
But I'm not an expert on traditional religion, but we've argued for centuries about sacrament, about tasting God, about being part of God, lots of pantheist beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't AI, I was going to say atheism, isn't AI just another form of pantheism, in the sense that we're all part of this thing? We may not always understand it, but we've all contributed a few words, for example, to the intelligence of ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude. So this is not something separate from us. We're all involved in the collective endeavor to create this God. We all have a piece of it, maybe a very small piece.
Yes, for sure. Unless what happens is it becomes sentient or it becomes conscious. And if we bring a digital mind into being, then are we a part of it? Has it become separate from us?
But you know, we've had lots of shows on this, and many books have been written warning us about a sentient or conscious AI.
Mm-hmm.
But even in that sense, it might be, in a sense, independent, but its logic, its consciousness, what you might call its ethics, are derived from us, because that's the only thing it's learned on, isn't it?
Well, it will have been given all of our collective knowledge and information, but none of us is able to possess that at a single time. A supercomputer could. That's what makes it godlike and very powerful. We have our own perspectives based on our life experiences and our limitations cognitively and otherwise. This being will not. This being will have the sum total of all of our information. And from that, it will be able to make all kinds of new inferences. And basically, it could invent its own language. It could develop capacities for understanding that, you know, as Arthur C. Clarke said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It could be so far beyond our capacity for understanding, we can't even imagine what that difference would be like.
I mean, We haven't always done a great job, Christopher. As you don't need me to tell you, governing ourselves, especially perhaps in the United States today. So shouldn't we be celebrating this new God that you describe in your book? Isn't this a reason to be cheerful, to rejoice?
Yes, yes. I'm very hopeful that there are a lot of good things that are going to be coming our way in the next few years. And AI is certainly going to deliver on that. And I'm hopeful in the medical sciences, especially. So, yeah, we should be celebrating. Absolutely. We should be celebrating. But there's a cautionary tale here. We want to make sure guardrails are in place so that it aligns with our sense of right and wrong, good and bad, so that it either can't be used by others to bring about and generate great harm, or let it somehow do this on its own. And if it's misaligned, how do we put the genie back in the bottle? Or if we can't, what's going to happen then?
You describe yourself, certainly on your LinkedIn page, as an ethicist. You're involved with a group called Convergence Analysis, UK-based think tank. What is an ethicist? What does that mean?
Yeah, so my job is to facilitate discussion around ethical procedure. So if I were to help a foundation, a company, an organization, an individual think ethically about behavior, I don't tell people what's right and wrong and how they should behave. I give them theoretical foundations from which they can make better decisions about behavior. So we will discuss various schools of thought, the utilitarian, deontological, divine command theory, virtue ethics, cultural relativism, egoism, contractarianism, libertarianism. There's quite a few ethical theories. And I make it more aware to people that when they have an ethical problem or a dilemma that they're facing, I've developed a systematic way of thinking through that. So it better helps them to come up with a response to that particular issue.
So you're, in a sense, as an ethicist, you're an aggregator of ethics, but do you have one of your own? I mean, those ones you've mentioned, utilitarianism, libertarianism, communitarianism, there's a whole school of many different schools of ethics that we as a species have created. Do you have one in particular that you rather fancy?
Well, I'm somewhat of what you call a principalist, and these are folks that kind of go through the cafeteria of ethical theories and pick what they like from each one. So
sort of eclectic.
A collective, yeah. So in certain situations, utilitarianism is the way to go, right? The greatest good for the greatest number. But if you just corner yourself into that particular theory, then it's really tough to consider the deontological aspects, right? So, and that's, what about people's dignity and what about autonomy, right? So the classic example, right, the trolley example, I can put this to you if you like.
Yeah, and we talked about the trolley example. In fact, we did it earlier this week with a University of Chicago philosopher.
There you go. So
Margaret, what was her name? Margaret Anscombe?
Yep, Margaret Anscombe. And others have referred to it as well. You're in San Francisco, you see a trolley coming down the hill, it's headed straight for 5 people working on the track. You can pull a switch and it'll divert the trolley down another track, but there's 1 person on that track. So you do nothing, 5 people killed. You pull the switch, 1 person is killed. What do you do? When I present this in classrooms and public lectures, most of the hands go up in favor of pulling the switch. Okay. And then we switch that up. Instead of on the switch, you're on a bridge watching this happen, and there's a large gentleman next to you. You could push him off the bridge. He would land on the track. That would stop the trolley. One person dies, 5 are saved. Same outcome, different process.
I mean, if he's a large person and maybe very fat, he's probably going to die anyway, right?
Well, that's so then that really raises the point, right? In the first case, we're truly just utilitarian. Greatest good for the greatest number. Spare 5, kill 1. It's a numbers game. Easy peasy, right? But then when you push Buddy off of the bridge, well, the deontologists want to say, what about his life? Like, doesn't he have dignity and autonomy? You're just using him as a means to an end. And that's why Immanuel Kant said, I wasn't thrilled with what Bentham said about utilitarianism. We got to think this through. It's not just about consequences. It's not just about outcomes. Otherwise, if it were, why wouldn't we just go to our prison systems in Texas and Florida and take everybody on death row and put them in gladiatorial games and have them fight to the death, and the winner gets to go free? Wouldn't that be an amusing thing for us to watch? Well, deontologists would say you're using them as a means to an end, and that's not fair. That's not right.
So is AI, my experience with AI is it's a little nervous to actually take positions. It lays out every different position, which ultimately makes it pretty useless, at least as an ethicist. Will we have in the future, Christopher, consequentialist AIs and principalist AIs and utilitarian AIs and Kantian AIs and Marxist AIs and nihilist AIs, all presenting different versions of ethics?
It is possible. It is possible. What we're most concerned with right now is what should be the ethical principles that guide human behavior using it, and what should be the ethical principles guiding the system itself. And that's the real tricky part. How do we figure this out? Because maybe we don't have a lot of time. There's a sense of urgency.
Yeah, it's like the trolley car, isn't it? It's coming for us, and we've got to make a split decision. One of the sections in your book, which I found particularly intriguing, was how to build a God in our own image, which is a very ambitious title, certainly of a chapter within a chapter, or a chapter within 3 sections in the book. There's a great deal of debate about who exactly we are. So what exactly does that mean, to build an ethic of AI in our own image? I mean, there's so much debate about who exactly we are, whether we're self-interested, whether we're designed to help others. Where do you even begin with that kind of thing?
Very good question. You saw back in 1942, Asimov had his 3 laws of robotics, right? He wanted to instill some kind of guardrail, ethical guidelines for, machine intelligence, but those can easily be, usurped or ignored. When we're trying to build a God in our image, what do we want out of this machine? Well, not to harm us, right? Don't harm us. Maybe we instill concepts of the golden rule, which almost every society has developed in their own way. But then there are principles of self-sufficiency, autonomy, liberty, things that we value as humans. And when we go around the world and we look at different societies and we talk to people, we can find universal principles that everybody tends to live by in their lives that we would want extolled in such a being as a super intelligent machine God. Okay. How do we do that?
Well, that's a controversial assumption. Give me an example of, if we go, you just said go around the world, we can find things in common. Everyone will claim to be good, but
right. We generally avoid discomfort, right? Most species on this planet don't favor that. So however defined,
they favor it for themselves, but maybe for others, they may not.
Well, that's it. But then when we put ourselves in the position of the other, there's the golden rule, right? So then that principle would then apply. Same with the no harm principle would apply as well. So we have to bring these principles collectively together to decide which lot is going to represent us the best. Now, the tricky thing is, what happens if the machine decides, well, your system of ethics is quaint, you humans, but you're no longer number one on this planet. You're now number two. I'm the smartest, most powerful predator on this planet. I'm the apex. So I'm going to come up with my system of rules. This is how I think the world should function. And that may occur, that may not occur. The thing is, we're acting under uncertainty. We don't know how this thing is going to behave when it comes into being.
Yeah, I mean, it is all very well. I mean, it might make a fun a film or maybe novel, science fiction novel, Christopher, but it doesn't seem to reflect the world as it is. You mentioned Asimov's essay in 1942. Of course, you've seen the Oppenheimer movie. The history of technology is much closer to Oppenheimer than it is to Asimov. And the reality of all technologies, for better or worse, is they're always used in the interest of its inventor. I mean, we're now dealing with Donald Trump's announcement of the Stargate project, which is something from OpenAI throwing hundreds of billions of dollars into AI investment for the US. Elon Musk is ambivalent about it. But all these technologies are, for better or worse, and I think most people probably think for worse, developed by companies and countries. America now, I think, has 80% of the investment in AI. So what's the point of these kind of abstract utopian thought experiments which have no real connection with the world as it is?
Yeah, well, I would disagree with that. I think we're heading exactly in that direction, and that is what Altman and the rest of the big tech folks would like. But the fact of the matter is, Altman et al. Know that the first ones to develop AGI will be the first trillionaires and will change the way in which humans do things forever. Right now, you and I and everybody else are in an in-between between how things used to be done and how things are going to be done. And AGI is going to be so transformative, we're not even close to being prepared for it. And that's the labor landscape. That's how medicine will be done. That's how science will be done. Maybe politics will be influenced by it as well. But we don't know precisely what is going to happen when AGI comes into being. It's going to be incredibly powerful. If it becomes autonomous, agentic, it becomes an agent unto itself. And then through recursive self-improvement and reinforcement learning, we just basically say to it, improve upon yourself. Just make yourself better and better and better. We better hope, like Irving John Good said, this thing is docile enough that it does what we want it to do.
But I don't think we necessarily disagree. I mean, you just said that the winners of this race are multi-trillion-dollar companies. That's the reality. The Sam Altmans and Elon Musks, even the Anthropic people, they're not gonna. They may have AI ethicists within their company, but they're always premised on their own self-interest, aren't they?
Yeah, and they end up firing them too when they say things they don't like.
So what's the point of an AI ethicist when these companies are shaping the world? Your book, As It Happens, is published, perhaps not coincidentally, by Prometheus Books. Prometheus, of course, was one of was best known, at least in antiquity, for defying the Olympian gods by taking fire from them and giving it to humanity in the form of technology, knowledge, and more generally civilization. Of course, it's a classic parable of antiquity. A few years ago, Ridley Scott made a movie called Prometheus in 2012 about a world in which companies like OpenAI and Google and Microsoft controlled the world. So isn't that the fear rather than this smart technology?
The fear being the humans who are creating it?
The fear being not the Promethean technology, but the owners of this technology, whether it's the multi-trillion-dollar companies are already controlling much of the stock market. So isn't that the real fear rather than AGI thinking for itself?
No, I would say that's a fear, and it's a good one for us to think about and prepare for. You know, if one company holds all that power, what's that going to do with, you know, wealth distribution, competition, you know, other countries that just simply can't catch up? It's going to create a host of problems. And that's why the organization I'm working with, we try to anticipate, you know, through various scenarios, what that might look
What does
like.
that mean, Christopher? I mean, for better or worse, 80% of the AI investment is coming from the US. Probably the other 20% is coming from China. Certainly very little from Europe. I'm just back from a big tech conference in Europe where the Europeans only seem to know how to regulate. The rest of the world is irrelevant when it comes to investment. All the dominant companies are US, maybe with the exception of one or two Chinese companies. So that's, for better or worse, that's the reality of this new technology, isn't it?
Yeah, the two big players are US and China. US is ahead of the curve. Who do we want to get there first and why? It looks like a lot of the activity is happening right where you are broadcasting from. So the Valley is pretty much the epicenter for AI, but that big compute farm down in Texas that's being built is that's essentially going to be one of the
So what's the goal of an ethicist in this world where US large, ridiculously large Promethean companies in the US control this new technology?
Right.
Are you trying to nurture ethicists within companies like OpenAI, or are you arguing in favor of regulation?
Right. So my function with Convergence is to raise AI awareness. So that's within the field itself, that's with policymakers, but also with the public, because the public have a right to know what's going on and they can vote. And if they know what's going on and they don't like it, they can express that in voting, and they can affect change through various institutions and systems. So as an ethicist, I try to raise awareness about what's going on.
But it seems as if you're just ignoring conveniently politics. In the US, the last election was between a globalizer, Harris, and a nationalist, Trump. Trump's MAGA movement was all in favor of America controlling as much of the world as it can. Greenland, Panama Canal, maybe even Canada, where you are, certainly AI. Democrats don't agree, although it seems at the moment they're a little bit in the minority. Aren't you just ignoring the reality of politics? Are you suggesting that politics and ethics are somehow separate?
Yes and no. I mean, politics is, you know, the way in which things get done within a civilization. Ethics should be the foundation of political decision making. It defines a country's state of being, and it gives them something to strive towards, values, principles, and these form the foundation or basis of any company or country, for that matter.
But that's not the case in the US. As you know, Trump never even pretended to be, or doesn't pretend to be, an ethicist. he believes in power, and the American people, again, for better or worse, seem to like that. So I'm not clear on what your ethical strategy on AI is supposed to do in the United States. You're trying to convince the Trump people, Musk and Sam Altman and all the others to be more ethical?
Partially, yeah. To what degree they'll listen, who knows? But if you let the public know, well, then the public can gather together and decide to vote in favor of or vote somebody out. So it's not just the tech people, because it appears to me they're not going to listen to anyone but themselves. So how do you affect change? Well, you go to the policymakers themselves, but you go to the public and you raise awareness as much as you can. Ring alarm bells, let people know this race is going on. And the majority of the world has no idea that it is.
But it's a very abstract idea that most people are concerned with. Economics, as Trump won the election because of the threat of immigration, at least perceived threat, and inflation, and economic issues. Most people don't. Most people have many too many practical concerns, day-to-day concerns, to be even bothered by this, let alone understand it.
And I understand that, but here's the deal. When nukes were developed, there was global angst. You know, who's got the bomb, who's going to drop the bomb, right? Now we have a system that's going to dwarf the power of nukes, because nukes require humans to turn keys, give codes, to, you know, make decisions. These powerful computer systems can usurp or bypass or otherwise manipulate our current systems to shut down electrical grids, to get into all kinds of computational systems, to move money around, to influence people, to manipulate leaders. And nukes couldn't do that. So the global angst that is about to emerge once the general populace of this world finds out what these big tech guys are racing to build, I think is going to dwarf the angst we saw in the Cold War era.
And yet, you may be right, Christopher, but this is a time of remarkably weak international institutions and governing bodies. The UN is a shadow of what it was, and even at its height, it wasn't a particularly powerful organization. So how's this supposed to manifest itself?
Well, let's hope we can develop a system of governance, perhaps international, that is a similar body to the IAEA, you know, International Atomic Agency, that can hold countries accountable for developments of AI tech and use of AI tech, but an agency that has teeth, not like the UN. Sort of some ne'er-do-well countries decide, hey, we're going to use this very powerful AI system to attack a defenseless country adjacent to us. That international agency would have the power to bring forth consequences for those actions. In other words, drone them back to the Stone Age.
Christopher, some people are going to be listening, watching this and thinking, it's just another liberal Canadian internationalist, globalist droning on about this stuff. Is there any truth to that? Are you trying to transform the world into one big Canada?
Well, I don't know. I'm a libertarian socialist, so no, really all I want is for AI to bring the world the very best it can while limiting the very worst that can happen. And how do we do that? That's the tricky part. That's what we're working on.
It is indeed a tricky part. It's the great question of our age. Christopher DiCarlo, the author of Building a God. Finally, Christopher, I always ask my guests this when we do shows on AI. Given our Blade Runner future, it's going to be harder and harder to distinguish between real people and smart machines.
Yep.
How would you prove that you're human and not just a smart machine, maybe one made in Canada articulating what you call libertarian socialism?
Yeah.
What's human about you?
What's human about me? Well, you know, philosophers have been asking that for millennia. I don't know if anybody's figured out what the right answer is, or even a decent answer, other than it's by analogy, right? That's all we have is analogical reasoning at this point. You seem like a human. I seem like a human to you. We share common characteristics and properties, and that's the best we can possibly do. I mean, you and I could be in a matrix scenario. You could be an android. I could be an android. You're never going to fully know. I don't know if there's any Voight-Kampff test that would make that type of determination, but there's a lot of trust that goes on. And, you know, I am basically a hypothetical realist, a Pyrrhonian skeptic. That means until otherwise, I'm going to believe what I see. And if I have other evidence to believe otherwise, I will follow where that evidence leads.
Well, maybe we're going to Blade Runner. Of course, that was also made by Ridley Scott, who made Prometheus, another version of the future. I would suggest people rewatch Blade Runner, Prometheus, as well, of course, as reading Christopher DiCarlo's new book, Building a God, The Ethics of Artificial Intelligence and the Race to Control It. I think he's convinced me he's human. So we'll have to have him back on the show when this thing really gets going and starts really profoundly destabilizing the world. Christopher, congratulations on the book and keep doing the good work. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.